This is a good space to target for innovation, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Distraction makers.
We've been noticing this design trend that seems to be emerging in modern trading card games, which is either the modification or the elimination of instant speed interaction.
And there's a lot of benefits to doing this. It keeps things a lot simpler. It is easier to create digitally, which anyone that's played Magic Arena in comparison to digital games can see there's not as many, do you pass? Do you pass now? Do you pass now?
Yeah. When we look at the way that interaction works in Magic, you have sort of a primary player and a secondary player in each turn, which means if you're a secondary player, you only get access to a subset of your cards, which are instant speed cards. When we look at is it my turn or my opponent's turn, one of the first things that you start thinking about is the sequential order in which cards should be played. And if it's your turn, this is based on I can play any of my cards. So what is the order in which I should play them in? And when your opponent doesn't have anything that they can play on my turn, I don't have to concern myself with the order in which I play things on my turn other than what is just most optimal for me, which means that play pattern is going to be the same often. Let's say I can play a 1-drop on a 2-drop on turn 3. So turn 1, I played a 1-drop. Turn 2, I played a 2-drop. Turn 3, I can play another 2-drop and a 1-drop. And the order in which I play those changes whether or not one of them gets a bonus or something. So the board state is something I've seen repeatedly because I only have so many 1s and 2-drops in my deck. And then that order is just, that's the order that I play them in.
I think that the important distinction here when it comes to non-instant speed spells in this moment is that because it is such a sort of a one-sided puzzle and interaction that you are having with your opponent's board, is that any one card, in order to have any sort of extra levels of decision points and depth in how you consider sequencing, would require a second card. But if you have a spell that could be played on your opponent's turn, that has a second card already associated with it because there's a possibility your opponent could play something as well.
It could be your opponent's second card,
right?
Or the second card is your opponent's card.
Otherwise, let's say in your example you have a 1 and a 2-drop, or you have a 3-drop on turn 3. So there is an interesting decision there where it's like, okay, well, do I play the 1 and the 2 or do I play the 3? And again, it depends very much on the puzzle and the circumstances that you're in at that exact moment. But it is a very one-sided decision and you know all the information and possibilities.
And you're not necessarily concerned with what your opponent might be able to do. So part of the way that sort of turns play out in trading card games is that there's a sort of a dynamic puzzle that you're navigating each turn, right? So if my opponent is not giving any kind of input into my execution, right, my puzzle that I'm solving, all I'm left with is whether or not I'm going to play a card and sequencing.
We've got a couple videos on this in the past, and we've kind of used this phrase before that we don't necessarily care about defining games, but we like seeing things that we see as sort of a consistent through line with games in order to slot in. And so a couple of those that we talk about are meaningful decisions, uncertain outcomes, and measurable results or feedback. And what ends up happening when your opponent can't react on your turn is that you don't have uncertain outcomes anymore. In the entirety of the game, you still do. You don't know what they're going to play on their next turn or whatever. But when we have discussed sub-games in the past and in other videos, this sort of ends up taking a sub-part of the game that might be its own game, chunked in a smaller form, and removes the uncertainty and outcome. So now you're in the safe space where you know everything that's going to happen. You just have to execute it as best as you can.
That execution becomes pretty simple when it's a handful of cards that are always in your deck. Now, So as far as like a sub-game example goes, right? Like let's say your opponent has a counterspell. This is, they have 2 untapped blue mana. It's turn 3. You could play a 3-drop or you could play a 1-drop and then a 2-drop. So now the sequential order, let's say the 3-drop is most optimal in this particular situation, but because your opponent might be able to interact with you, you're put into a position where, well, maybe I want to play the 1-drop and then the 2-drop or vice versa. So that way I still get something on the board, even if my opponent does have a counterspell. And then we get into that situation where my opponent might also be bluffing, right? We've now created an opportunity in a cat and mouse game of, well, my opponent has hidden information of interaction on my turn. I have to try to figure out how to effectively figure out what that is before I can play most optimally.
I think it's a significantly more deeper well of decision making and tactics that you have to consider with instant speed spells. And it's because of what you're talking about with the potential for counter spells, is that because any action that you take, your opponent can potentially interact with, it means that you now have the opportunity to bluff, meaning that you even have a sub game for your opponent to try and figure out, which is just, oh, should I play everything from my hand that I can, or should I leave 2 untapped blue mana to bluff that I have
the next turn, right?
Right.
Yeah, you're even thinking about that next interaction on your opponent's turn.
Let's maybe talk about some games that are sort of in between this, right?
Yeah.
So you brought up Yu-Gi-Oh! You mentioned Hearthstone. I think Netrunner is also a really good example that like not a lot of people bring up.
Yeah, we need to do a deep dive on Netrunner here at some point, but
we've played it, just not a lot.
Not enough. Yeah.
But I think that you get a lot of that similar outcome. When we're talking about uncertainty of outcome, a trap card is that. Yeah. That's where you don't know what your opponent could potentially do to you. You know they could do something, but you're not sure what. And something like a trap card, or in Netrunner's case, they have it's like corporation cards turned sideways or whatever. It's very similar to trap cards. And that's really all we're talking about, is that on your turn, even if your opponent can't actively do something, there's something that they have set up
that could happen.
That could potentially happen.
Yeah. And there's a lot of games that do this. Hearthstone, Netrunner, like you said, Yu-Gi-Oh! Just to get it gives. Part of what's important here and what's being preserved in these other systems is that there is some kind of partial information, right? Like Hearthstone with the secrets, they've got the little question mark that pops up that lets you know, oh, my opponent has played a secret. I don't know what it is, but it will activate potentially depending upon how I play my turn out.
And this is why hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are terrible. But like I said, we're not talking about a hand trap.
Right. There's no information at all. It's just, oh, there it is. Right.
Yeah.
One thing I will bring up is that this particular solution, I don't know about Yu-Gi-Oh! I guess probably Yu-Gi-Oh! Too, but one turn kill combos, right? OTK combos.
That's a problem in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Okay, yeah. This sort of solution to instant speed, where it's one that sort of has to be set up on your turn, and then it is just sort of a reaction to a particular trigger that your opponent is doing, creates these situations where, okay, well, sometimes there is no interaction and you know there is no interaction, so you just can do your one turn kill combo and win the game, and your opponent has no recourse at all. There is another style of turn structure that we've seen emerge in some other TCGs recently. Legends of Runeterra, Artifact, and Altered use a turn and round system. So you have like sort of individual turns, and then there's sort of a round marker that switches between the players somehow.
Right. Yeah. It's like a priority passing.
Yeah,
system.
But priority passing.
Yeah. Honestly, like it seems like this has been growing in popularity.
I think mostly because of its utility for digital. In a digital space, this turn structure works particularly well because the markers of whose turn it is or whose action it is switches back and forth a lot. And if a computer can do it, it's pretty easy to track.
I think it's safe, and it also gets a lot of what we're talking about available to the player, right? It gets a lot more of that cross interaction.
So the way that it works is if you have priority, you could take one action, and then priority gets passed to your opponent. Very similar to the stack in Magic, except everything in the game works that way. So it's almost as if everything is instant speed. And so if I was to play, a unit to the board, then I pass priority to my opponent. They can then do something before I get to play another thing to the board. And as we talked about before, this interrupts that those sort of play patterns still, right? Where, okay, I want to play these 2 units, but I get to play one, and then my opponent could do something, and then I get to play the second one, but something may have changed. That means I don't want to play that second one anymore, or I want to play something else instead.
I think there's a lot of positives to this. I think there's some negatives as well. I think somewhat in a lot of these games you can kind of you lose some of that flow. I think something I like generally about Magic, I like the asymmetry in Magic, and that like not every turn is the same. But when playing, stuff like Altered or Artifact, it can feel very samey. I think Artifact actually kind of has this disruption because there's like the shop phase, and that's a nice like palate cleanser that sort of is like, all right, I'm making decisions that my opponent is not part of, and then it goes back to this sort of interaction. But I think that's kind of like my only main issue with it.
I could see there. The part of the issue is that that anxiety that you have when you're playing against a counterspell, like you're mentioning, that's all the time, right? So you are always trying to bait out something from your opponent before you get to play without any interaction from your opponent. So the ebb and flow is not there as much until your opponent runs out of mana,
which happens, and then it's funny because if you play something like Altered or whatever, you'll notice this significant difference when you're kind of playing this all right, I'm only going to spend 1 mana, and they're only going to spend 1 mana, and then they finally spend all their mana, and you go, oh, okay, thank God. And then you start unloading your whole hand.
Right, yeah. Another pattern that I've noticed that emerges within the system is that it does feel almost sort of particularly punishing of things that cost a lot of mana. So if you are spending a lot of mana, you are effectively giving your opponent the ability to play whatever they want, right? There's no more interaction, and they know it. And so that thing that costs a lot of mana, it better be really good. It better be worth that amount of yielding to your opponent to do whatever they want.
I think it's tough, but what I like about these is that I think that this is an interesting direction that games are starting to take. I think there's even more exploration there. I think there's even more possibilities in this sort of Yu-Gi-Oh! Netrunner space as well, of setting up a puzzle for your opponent. I think that the one-turn kill problem is definitely still a thing, but I feel like that's sort of some lesser touched areas of design.
Runeterra specifically, there's the other type of system with the the turns and rounds. They do have some cards that operate almost at an instant speed.
They
have
burst spells.
Different spell speeds.
They got burst and fast and slow.
It's a lot. It's a lot, but I see what they're attempting to do, and it might be the same kind of thing, right? Where you're trying to chunk down the cards that can be played in that moment, so you do kind of come back to that. Oh, well, I know I can play these things, or interact with my opponent on top of their interaction, basically. Okay, so in general, when you have this moment of if I can play things on my opponent's turn or not. That's a split that's very close to the baseline positional heuristic of the game, which then has branching, cascading effects that fills out almost an entire half of the tree. And if you turn that off, it simplifies the game, it reduces anxiety, but it also decreases sort of the strategic depth of the game potentially.
But there are other possibilities, right?
Yeah,
there's other you can just simply not have instant speed spells, or you could do some of these other sort of sort of in between versions that we talked about, or there's other versions that people still haven't even probably thought of or designed yet.
Yeah, this is a good space to target for innovation, I think.
Yeah, for sure.